pleasant day to all of us here. Today we will be discussing about the electrical installations in Class 1 and Class 2 hazardous locations according to the Philippine Electrical Code. Since this presentation is too long, almost has 85 slides, so I will summarize this to maximize our time. Okay, I'll summarize the key points from the provided content of the PowerPoint presentation, focusing on clarity and structure using bullet points. This presentation here presented to you primarily covers electrical installations in Class 1 and Class 2 hazardous locations according to the Philippine Electrical Code. These locations are classified based on the presence of flammable gases or vapors, which is Class 1, or combustible dust, which is Class 2. The presentation outlines specific requirements for electrical equipment and wiring in these hazardous environments to minimize the risk of fire or explosion. For Class 1 locations, which are the flammable gases or vapors, Division 1 locations where ignitable concentrations of flammable gases or vapors are present continuously, intermittently, or periodically under normal operating conditions, which means that in the Division 1s, it is a location where ignitable or flammable gases are mostly located. So for motors and generators, it must be identified for Class 1 Division 1 locations. Alternatives include totally enclosed types with positive pressure ventilation or any earth gas filled enclosures with appropriate safety mechanisms. Specific conditions apply for machines submerged in flammable liquids or gases within restricted industrial establishments. Temperature limits are imposed on external surfaces to prevent auto-ignition of gases or vapors. So, for luminaires or the lighting fixtures must be identified as a complete assembly for Class 1 Division 1 locations and marked with maximum lamp wattage. Protection against physical damage is required. Pendant luminaires must be supported by threaded rigid metal conduit stems or steel intermediate conduit stems with secure joints and bracing. Specific box or fittings types are required for luminaire support. Next is we have the utilization equipment. All utilization equipment must be identified for Class 1 Division 1 locations. And flexible cords permitted for portable lighting and utilization equipment and where fixed wire methods are insufficient, must be extra hard usage type with an equipment grounding conductor. Specific termination requirements apply, including the use of listed cord connectors. Next is, let's move on to receptacles and attachment plugs. Hmm, Here. So, attachment plugs must provide connection to the equipment grounding conductor or be identified for location. So, let's move on to class 2 locations. Must be identified for must be identified for class 1 division 2 locations or class 1 division 1 locations under certain conditions. O- Open or non explosion proof enclosed motors, examples are squirrel cage induction motors, are permitted if they lack arc producing devices. Space heaters must meet temperature requirements or be identified for class 1 division 2 locations. So for the luminaires must comply with class 1 division 1 standards or be tested to determine the mark operating temperature. Protection against physical damage is required. Pendant luminaires must be suspended by appropriate stems. Portable lighting equipment must comply with Class 1 Division 1 standards. Switches and starting equipments must meet specific requirements. So, as you have observed, our presentation does not align with what I am saying because I'm only um, summarizing the content of this presentation to shorten and to easily understand the content. So, for utilization equipment, heaters must not exceed 80% of the auto ignition temperature of the gas or vapor involved. Motors must comply with the standard outlined in 5.1.3.26b. Switches, circuit breakers, and fuses must comply with 5.1.3.16b. So for flexible cords, it must be the same as Division 1. Receptacles and attachment plugs, same also as Division 1. For signaling, alarm, remote control, and communication systems, contacts must have enclosures identified for Class 1 Division 1 locations, and there are some exceptions for that. So, for Class 2 locations, which include the combustible dust, in general, it must cover electrical equipment and wiring in locations where fire or explosion hazards exist due to combustible dust. Explosion-proof equipment is generally not required or acceptable unless also identified for Class 2 locations. In Division 1, locations where combustible dust is present in the air under normal operating conditions in sufficient quantities to produce explosive or ignitable mixtures, or where mechanical failure or abnormal operation might cause such mixtures to be produced. For the wiring methods, rigid metal conduit or threaded steel intermediate metal conduit. Type MI cable with listed termination fittings. Specific types of MC or and ITC cables in certain industrial establishments only. Optical fiber cables and raceways with seals. Flexible connections must be dust tight. For boxes and fittings must be dust tight. Transformers and capacitors, those containing liquid that will burn, must be installed in volts meeting specific requirements. Specific requirements for Group E locations. So first switches, circuit breakers, motor controls, and fuses must have enclosures identified for the location. Control transformers and resistors must have enclosures also identified for the location. Motors and generators must be identified for the location or totally enclosed pipe ventilated. For the luminaires, each luminaire must be identified for the location and marked with the maximum lamp wattage. Protection against physical damage is required also. Pendant luminaires must be suspended by appropriate stems. And for the utilization equipment, all utilization equipment must be identified for the location. Flexible cords, same as class 1, with addition of specific requirements for dust-tight cord connectors. So for the receptacle and attachment plugs, for the receptacle and attachment plugs, receptacles must be part of the premises wirings. Attachment plugs must provide connection to the equipment grounding conductor. Signaling, alarm, remote control, and communication systems. For these, switches, circuit breakers, and contacts must have enclosure identified for the location. Resistors, transformers, and other heat generating equipment must have enclosures identified for the location. For the Division 2 of Class 2, locations where combustible dust is not normally in the air in sufficient quantity to produce explosive or ignitable mixtures, but where dust accumulations may be sufficient to interfere with the normal operation of electrical equipment. The wiring methods of the Class 2 Division 2, all wiring methods permitted in Division 1: rigid metal conduit, intermediate metal conduit, electrical metal like tubing, and dust-tight wareways. Specific types of MCMI, PLTC, ITC, MVTC, and TCER cables. Optical fiber cables in cable trays or raceway with seals. For the boxes and fittings, must be dust tight also. Transformers and capacitors, those containing liquid that will burn, must be installed in volts. Specific requirements for transformers containing ascarel. Right type transformers must be installed in volts or have enclosed windings and terminal connections. For the switches, circuit breakers, motor controllers, and fuses, they must have enclosures. The enclosures must be dust tight or otherwise identified for the location. Control transformers and resistors. Switching mechanisms must have dust tight enclosures. Coils and windings must have dust tight enclosures. Resistors must have dust ignition proof enclosures. For the motors and generators, must be totally enclosed non-ventilated, totally enclosed pipe ventilated, or dust ignition proof. For the luminaires, portable lighting equipment must be identified for the location. Fixed lighting must have dust tight enclosures or be marked with maximum lamp wattage. For the utilization equipment in Class 2 Division 2, heaters must be identified for the location. Motors must comply with 5.2.3.26b. Switches, circuit breakers, and fuses must comply with 5.2.3.16b. Transformers, solenoids, impedance coils, and resistors must comply with 5.2.3.21b. For the flexible cords, same as Class 1, with the addition of specific requirements for dust-tight cord connectors. Receptacles and attachment plugs. Receptacles must be part of the premises wiring. Attachment plugs must provide connection to the equipment grounding connector. For the signaling, alarm, remote control, and communication systems, the contacts must comply with 5.2.3.51a1 or be installed in dust-tight enclosures. Transformers and similar equipment must comply with 5.2.3.21b2. Resistors and similar equipment must comply with 5.2.3.21b3. Rotating machinery must comply with 5.2.3.26b. So for the general requirements applicable to both Class 1 and Class 2 locations, grounding and bonding, wiring and equipment must be grounded as specified in Article 2.50. Lock nut bushing and double lock nut types of contact shall not be depended on for bonding purposes. For the ceiling, where a raceway provides communication between enclosures with different protection requirements, sealing is required to prevent the ingress of hazardous materials. For the surge protection, surge arresters and surge protective devices installed in a Class 2 Division 1 location shall be in suitable enclosures. So, what I've discussed to you is the summary is a summary. It is a structured overview of the presentation's content, emphasizing the key requirements for electrical installations in hazardous locations as identified by the Philippine Electrical Code. So that is all for the presentation, a summarized form of the presentation. So thank you all for listening. Goodbye. Have a nice day.